introduction to Fairhurst. You may have heard of us or maybe not. We're a sort of mid-sized engineering consultancy, but we're a sort of private partnership in the UK as well. We've got offices all over the country, 7 of which are here in Scotland. Our head office is in Glasgow, and that's where Corin and myself are based in the geotechnical environmental engineering team. So yeah, to start the talk tonight, before we dive into various remedial works, I'll just explain very simply some different types of rockfall hazards and how we might measure risk, which will then obviously lead into why you need to remediate them. But before we get into the good stuff, I'll just touch on some paperwork. So there's no specific legislation that relates to the management of rockfall hazards. There's no Eurocode, no British standards that tells you definitively under certain circumstances when you should and shouldn't do something. The elephant in the room is obviously the quarry regulations. Most of the work that we do doesn't really come under the quarry regulations, but we'll touch on that a bit later. There are, however, plenty of sort of guides to good practice on the topic, and one in particular was published a few years ago by the TRL, the Transport Research Lab, and that's got lots of useful information that's still relevant today. So starting at the very start, how do we know if we have a problem with our rock slopes? We first need to try and understand the risk that it may or may not pose. So the first question we'll ask ourselves is, do we have any hazards? Is there something that's got the potential to cause harm? So obviously in the context of a rock slope, that's going to be, is there a rockfall or a block that could fall and land on something? We then need to ask, can that hazard impact anything? Is there a receptor? So what I mean by that is it doesn't just necessarily have to be a pedestrian that rock could hit. Is there a building? Is there a structure or even a piece of infrastructure like a road or a path that could be affected? So we'll then look at the hazard and say, right, well, we need to try and get a feel for how likely is it that that hazard could occur. And that's going to be things like, well, what is the joint structure? What's the strength of the discontinuities? What's the weathering of the rock mass? All these factors will feed into that. We would also make an assessment on what would be the consequence in the event that that hazard occurs. And again, the consequence doesn't just have to be, injury to a person or worse. That could be if the rockfall blocks a road or a path, and then it means that you don't have any access along that route, then there could be consequences to program delivery and things like that. So there's 4 main types of rockfall hazards. So I'll talk about each of these in turn. So first one, very simply, I'm sure you've seen it all over the place, planar sliding. This is when we have material that's sat on a joint or a discontinuity and that surface is dipping towards you, and it needs to have sort of release mechanisms on the side, but basically that surface is dipping greater than the friction angle, so that material can slide towards you on that single plane. If we have 2 surfaces that intersect and it still is pointing towards you and could slide out at the face, then that's what we would call wedge sliding. So then there's sort of friction on 2 surfaces at play there. The final sort of failure mechanism that's controlled by joints in the rock mass is called toppling. I guess the best way to describe this is think of books on a bookshelf. If you've got quite a skinny magazine, that by itself is going to fall over and you need a proper ornament against it to hold it up. But if you've got a big fat Oxford dictionary, that's going to probably stand up on its own. So in order for toppling to occur, the block needs to be taller than it is wide, so that its center of gravity is actually leaning forward slightly, and then that can have some rotation to it. So that's toppling, when you've got tall sort of books, thinking on a bookcase. So finally, the sort of last category of failure mechanism is called raveling. And raveling isn't so much controlled by the orientation of the joints, but it's more to do with the spacing. So if you've got an area of the rock slope where you've got very closely jointed rock mass, or if it's artificial sort of fracturing from blast damage, then that can cause these raveling failures, which is relatively small blocks that will sprawl and unravel from the slope. But it can also be caused by an area where the rock mass is more weathered, or if you've got more vegetation or sort of water seepage, like that. So we know what sort of hazards we can be looking out for. Now, what do we do? It's called the hierarchy of rockfall hazard control. Doesn't really mean that any one technique is better than another, but it's certainly a thought process that we all go through when we are sort of starting off with a new situation. So the first question we'll ask ourselves is, can a hazard be avoided? Can you just not go there? Can you put up a fence, keep everybody out, let nature take its course, stay away from the area? In some circumstances, yes, you can, and that's often the cheapest and easiest thing to do. But for most sites, that probably won't be an option. So then we would ask ourselves, can we remove the hazards? And again, it comes into what type of hazard do you have? Is it sort of small scale surface instability? Can that be treated with just some light scaling? Or does it need removal of the entire rock slope? And is that possible? You need to ask yourself, will sort of scaling, will that treat all the hazards? Or will that allow other hazards to develop in the future? And so if you sort of scale the slope once, in 6 months' time, 2 years' time, 10 years' time, will you be back at square one? Or will the removal of one hazard create another? So if you remove the small block from underneath the big one, does that now mean that the big one's lost its support and that can now fail? So if we think that removing the hazards isn't going to be the best solution for our site, then we would look at saying, right, well, can we either strengthen the hazards, which means sort of support them up on the slope so that they don't fail in the first place, or can we allow the hazards to occur, but we'll contain them in a sort of designated area, or we'll separate them from the receptor? It's quite common for sites or projects to actually involve more than one of these elements. So you might scale the rock slope first, then install rockfall netting, or you might install some reinforcement dowels and then use a catch fence somewhere. So you can use a combination to treat different hazards that you have. I'll leave a void and removal for now. Corin will come on to those shortly, but I'll just sort of very quickly touch on strengthen and contain. So quick intro, strengthening. As mentioned, this is basically when we're going to want to prevent the rockfall from occurring in the first instance. We want to keep it in situ. So for most techniques, there's going to be an element of essentially attaching that potentially unstable material into something that is stable. And this can easily be done using steel bars drilled through the unstable material and anchored into the sort of stable ground behind. Or we can use sort of structural facing, so sprayed concrete, wire meshes, and sort of waving beams also to provide support to the material of the surface. And again, that would get anchored back into something stable. So I'll come back to some more specific examples of this a bit later. Examples of containment. So if we can't strengthen the hazard, or there's too many of them, then we can look at allowing the failures to occur, but we're going to want to contain them in an area where there's no receptor. So that's going to be things like draped rockfall netting, which would be attached at the crest and usually attached to the toe, but not always. And that allows the material to sort of trickle behind the netting and then accumulate down the toe where it can be maintained or removed. And catch fences, obviously, they would be designed to at a height and position such that any sort of falling material can be kept behind that fence. The main thing with containment is you do need to have space, and that can often be the sort of controlling factor between whether you can use containment or whether you need to strengthen your hazards. But so before we get ahead of ourselves, yeah, avoidance and removal, let's not forget about those. They can still be very effective at treating rockfall hazards. So I'll hand over to Corin for our first case study. Yeah.
Thank you very much. If I can drive both things at the same time. There we are. So I'm going to chat about a case study which is familiar to some people in the room and maybe a bit further afield as well. And that is Bardon Hill Quarry. So originally at the quarry, there was quite a noticeable area of large scale instability on one of the faces. And the operator at the time was basically implementing a sort of partial avoidance strategy, staying away from underneath that area to try and limit the consequences of failures. The problem being it was sterilising some of the resource and it was limiting future sinkings by basically narrowing the geometry of the bottom of the quarry. So an alternative approach was required in targeting the hazards instead of the consequences. Even if you're not in the quarrying industry, I'm pretty sure a lot of people will know the name Bardon, as it's written on the side of a lot of the lorries there. So where are we at Bardon Hill? So we are in Coalville in Leicestershire, but the name is a bit of a misnomer as there's not actually any coal there. It's a Neoproterozoic or Precambrian igneous rock, and it's got some really, really persistent joints in it. And then the overburden in the quarry is Mercia mudstone, the Triassic age. The two main rock types had some local terminology that was used. The igneous rock was termed the granite, although if you're going to be a geological purist, it's actually a dacite. And the Mercia mudstone is termed the marl, but I believe that goes back to the, let's say, the old-fashioned term for that, which was the Kuiper marl. And there's quite a complex interface between the two rock types there. You can see I've drawn that sort of sinusoidal line on the page there. And it's not just sinusoidal looking at it in that plane, it actually was like that into the face as well. So in some places it was almost like a big egg box. So the area that we were working in is about 100 metres high, this big promontory here. The joints in the granite rock were really, really persistent, tens of metres, 20, 30, 40, 50 metres persistence. They were inconveniently angled at about 45 and 50 degrees from the horizontal, and the orientation of them was what was important, similar to the two sides of the promontory. So basically what Henry was saying before about planar sliding, you had joints, same orientation as the face, and potential for planar sliding. And because these joints were so persistent, you had potential for really large volume failures here. So a big problem needed a big solution. And what we did here was reprofiling. So not a regrade, we didn't change the overall angle of the slope significantly, but what we did was change the orientation. So if you're a geology person and you're into using stereo nets to look at rock slope stability, we're basically rotating the slope around so that you could no longer have these sliding failures daylighting on the face. So we're basically going to cut the nose off this big promontory. We're going to remove the hazards, but limit the development of future big planar sliding hazards. There were, however, lots and lots of other joints within the rock. They were less persistent, but no less important because they were causing potential for sort of localised instability. So what we were doing here was dealing with the big hazards with the profiling, but there were smaller hazards that we were going to have to work around as we went forward. And one of the ways that we tried to limit those was pre-split blasting of the faces, giving us greater control over the geometry, of course, but helping to produce a cleaner face and try and reduce the need for some of the other types of remedial works. A big benefit to this is obviously we're blowing up a lot of stone, but that stone is actually part of the resource of the quarry, so that stone could be won as part of the works. And we had a similar approach at Tarmack's quarry in North Yorkshire at Arkhow. Also a great place to chat about, but not enough time tonight. So a couple of things that had to be taken into account when we were developing the design here was two quite significant constraints on geometry. So we were constrained at the toe. Although we were, or the quarry operator was avoiding a lot of operations down there, we still had haul roads and workings to deal with. And we were really constrained at the crest as well. The land ownership up there was not for aggregate industries, it's third-party land, and there's also a triple SI up there as well. So it meant that we were quite constrained top and bottom. So what we had to try and fit in there with our 15-metre lifts was 70-degree slopes, and the bench widths actually had to be 5 metres at the top, a couple of lifts, and 7 down below. So quite narrow. We basically had space for vehicles, edge protection, but there wasn't a lot of space for any toe protection. So your kind of classic quarry technique of risk reduction from slopes above you with a rock trap, just wasn't enough space for that at all. So quite a constrained place. So how did we look at the design through here? Well, bit of GI, there's some borehole logs. There was a lot of visual inspection of the faces themselves to try and tie down where the interface lay, and a lot of mapping of the discontinuities and the joints within the granite rock itself. And that allowed the generation of an LSS model, a 3D model of that interface. And the other benefits of LSS here was they're able to give setting out points for the blast designs, and also allowing calculations to be made of the volume of material that could be taken off-site and also processed. So you can see we are basically, as I said, cutting the nose off that promontory there and getting ourselves into the good stuff. So as I mentioned, the reprofiling work was targeting this large-scale instability, but unfortunately we weren't able to design out all of that small-scale instability. There were just too many joints giving us too many things happening. But before we even got to the granite and thinking about the different failure mechanisms there, we had to excavate first through the marl rock. And our design slope angle there was 45 degrees. Again, because of these constraints, a lot of the time we were actually having to get the slopes in at 70. So those steeper angled slopes needed a pattern of dowels and some high tensile netting, which is a type of containment, but it's also, there's a little bit of a strengthening element to it as well, which is something that Henry will touch on. Once we got into the granite, we were using our favourite thing here, which is stereo nets. And for each of the faces that was being blasted, we were taking the data that we'd recorded on the joints in order to understand the potential failure mechanisms we were going to have, and therefore whether we needed any localised remedial works. And spoilers, unfortunately we did. We needed some rock reinforcement dowels in places and also some containment netting. And as I said, we didn't have space for our kind of usual quarry containment of rock traps there, so we were unable to avoid needing a few more works. So here we are, going from what looked like quite a messy area over on the left-hand side, quite a lot of blasting work done, and that was the sort of bench configuration we were aiming for on the right-hand side. So the client was Aggregate Industries, but the majority of the work on site was done by BAM Ritchies. And I know several of you in the room are very familiar with this quarry. So BAM Ritchies did all the drilling and blasting, but also all the geotechnical work as well, so the netting, the dowels, etc. The other main contractor involved was JC Balls, and that was the local earth moving contractor, so they did a lot of the excavation of the marl and taking that off to tip. Oops, uh-oh, how did I manage to do that? Get too excited here. Does it just need to go back onto the... Yeah. Whatever I did, don't do that again. So yeah, a few photos here of some of the works in progress. This was some of the other remedial work that we were doing on site. On the left-hand side, you can see a steep face in the marl, and that's got our netting and pattern dowels. Over on the right-hand side, we've got some netting going in on one of the granite slopes. And hopefully you can see on both images, again, just kind of how tight some of these benches were. And then in the middle one there, you can see what we were dealing with on the benches, slope in the marl, and then there's our nice sort of sinusoidal interface with the granite coming into place there as well. And just another view of the work in progress. The yellow line is where that interface was coming in, and hopefully you can see there the dumper and the excavator, just to give you that sense of scale there. And I haven't been to the quarry for quite a long time. This work was actually largely done sort of 2008, 2009. So I did have to go to the internet to get a more recent quarry image of what the face looks like. I've credited the photographer there. But hopefully you can see between the red circles in both images, the kind of horrible looking promontory beforehand, and really nice tidy looking work to get that promontory knocked off. But I've shown the yellow circle on there as well, because I think it shows just how much that work was then able to open up the lower levels of the quarry for further work to be done. So that's the original Bardon Hill, in case anyone's interested. It's nothing to do with the big extension that I know is now in place. But like the Great Wall of China, you can see it from space. And here's our, that's our kind of promontory area there, and a little notch that was also cut to manage some of these orientations. So the large scale hazard was removed, although we did have to deal with our small scale hazards as well. So I'm going to pass you back to Henry now. He's going to talk a bit about the strengthening, which was one of the techniques we had to do here, but slightly different scale and a different location.
Yeah, thank you. Right, a little bit of theory. So strengthening techniques, we mentioned it very briefly earlier. So these techniques are going to be providing support to blocks and preventing them from sort of detaching and falling. So run through a couple of different things that we have in our sort of arsenal. Top right is some dentition. That's used often to sort of fill voids. So you would typically sort of shutter a facing and pour concrete in behind there. Depending on where you are, you can obviously make that facing nice with sort of stonework, and or just leave it as the concrete. The bottom right is a buttress. You quite often see these on the railway, sort of old Victorian works, and up the A9 and places like that, you'll see sort of buttresses up to rock slopes quite a lot. And they're quite good if you've got a localized feature that really just needs some support, then does what it says on the tin, provides the support. Dentition and buttressing, I guess, are not necessarily the first thing you would jump to these days, mostly because they're quite time consuming to install, but doesn't mean you can't use them. And I've got projects where I'm using both of these. So they are still in use. Sort of middle on the top, obviously sprayed concrete. To be honest, that's something I have never actually been involved in. But essentially, you still need to have a steel mesh that gets attached to the rock face, and then you apply your solid or your rigid facing. And that means that, yeah, anything that pushes up against that mesh from the concrete is going to be sort of supported, that load will get transferred. I guess the good thing about sprayed concrete is it protects the slope below from ongoing weathering, so water, vegetation, all of these things will be coming in from the surface, but you would need to be mindful, obviously, of sort of groundwater or any water acting on the back of that sprayed concrete. The middle bottom picture is some cables. I had a site, and if you think your block isn't going to be able to sort of resist either the drilling, or so it might split and fracture if you're going to drill through it, or if you've got a large void behind and so your grout's going to go everywhere, then you could look and see if you could actually secure some anchors around the hazard and then use cables to sort of strap across it and brace it that way. Grouted anchors, yeah, obviously they're a fairly common technique. I'll come on to those shortly. But also, yeah, rockfall netting. So rockfall netting, a bit of an umbrella term, surprisingly or not surprisingly. There's different types of netting. Some of it can be used just as containment, so it's passive. But the high tensile rockfall netting, that's designed so that, and again, using a sort of an array of intermediate fixing anchors throughout the rock slope, the sort of graphic on the left, you position these in all the low points, all the hollows, and that means that the netting is pulled tight into the slope so that the wire mesh is sort of in positive contact with the ground, and it's always providing support. So as soon as any material goes to detach, it will not go anywhere. It's already being supported and held in place. So reinforcement dowels, again, kind of bread and butter of remedial works. And I'm sure you'll have seen these everywhere, if not, worked with them yourself. I guess the key thing with these is they're a passive element. What I mean by that is, well, so you drill your hole, install your bar, you either use cementitious grout or sort of polymer-based resin to bond it to the rock, the stable rock behind the failure plane. The bar isn't doing anything until if and when the block is going through detaches. And it's at that point that all that weight will then get transferred to the tendon and then through the bond into the ground behind. I'll come on to active anchors next, but yeah, just quickly. So you can either, depending on what angle you put reinforcement dowels in, the two main sort of properties are the sort of shear strength of the bar, and you can choose that by increasing your steel grade or the diameter of the bar, and the pull-out resistance of the bar. And again, you can increase that by varying the length that you design that anchor to. So ideally, you would install these such that they're working in a combination of shear and pull-out, so you're getting the best of both properties. But yeah, again, depending on your sort of site geometry and access, things like that, if they're installed perpendicular to the failure plane, then it will just be working in shear. So yeah, reinforcement dowels are passive, and that's fine if you've got a block and yet you work out what its mass is and how much load it would be exerting onto a bar, and if that bar can support those loads, happy days. But what if you've got a much larger mass and the stabilizing force that would be required to hold that is beyond, you might need 50 or 100 dowels to get that equivalent strength, and obviously that's just not going to be practical to install in some places. So we can then use sort of tensioned rock anchor or rock bolt. These, I guess they look a little bit different on the surface. You tend to have this sort of top hat configuration. I mean, in principle, it's a similar sort of thing. You would still drill your hole through your block that you're trying to stabilize. Once you get into your material behind or below that's stable and isn't going anywhere, that's when you're then going to bond either steel bar or probably steel cables. And then when you sort of attach the sort of head configuration, you're going to be applying, actively applying a sort of tensional force on those cables. And what that will do is essentially you are squeezing that block up against the rock slope, applying that stabilizing force. So yeah, that's all very well and good. The sort of downside to using tensioned reinforcement is there does need to be ongoing inspection and maintenance. That the load that you start off with in these anchors, it will dissipate over time. The cables will relax. So you do need to periodically go back and check them, see what is the load. And if the load has dropped, then retighten. So quick case study on some strengthening. So we'll head up to we had a sort of framework with network relevant QTS on the CP6 earthworks, and they asked us to look at sort of lots of rock slopes in the area, and a few of them were kind of either side of the Glenfinnan Viaduct, so that was quite exciting. And the network rail, they as part of their kind of asset management, they've got their own systems to sort of rapidly inspect slopes and do a high level appraisal of what is the perceived risk of rockfall from these assets. And these slopes got flagged up as requiring a detailed inspection. So where are we? We're up in the sort of Moyne supergroup, the meta sediments, and in and amongst these sediments, you get these sort of granite gneiss intrusions, which is formed from sort of partial melting of that host rock. So we're in one of these sort of granite gneiss intrusions, and it's a box cutting. And what I mean by that is you have a cutting on both sides. as soon as you come out of that cutting, you're straight away into a very steep embankment. And then that steep embankment immediately leads onto the viaduct. You're also on a sort of slight curve in the track. So the train drivers wouldn't really have much sighting distance if they were to come around the corner and find material lying in the track. So obviously the consequence of a rockfall here is going to be quite extreme. So yeah, we went and did our inspections. So again, the first thing we look for is what are the hazards. And so again, looking at the joints and the rock structure, we found planar sliding. There's also some wedges in the upper slope. And because of the joint spacing in the granite, it actually produced quite large block sizes, up to sort of 2 meters cubed. We've also got quite a narrow, or the space between the track and the toe of the slope is really quite narrow. I guess obviously back in the sort of late 1800s or so, when they formed this railway, they're going to want to excavate as little rock as possible. So the slopes are going to be as steep as possible, and the track as narrow as it can be, which then means we don't really have much wiggle room for any material coming off those slopes. It's immediately going to sort of interfere with rolling stock on that line. So after a risk appraisal, what's the likelihood of that hazard occurring? Well, yeah, we've got all the structures, all the mechanisms there, so failure is possible. The consequence, again, steep embankment, curve onto a viaduct, so very severe, and that gave us obviously a high risk, so that instigated the requirement for the remedial works. So what did we do, or how did we choose what we did? Again, we go through that flowchart. First thing we ask ourselves is, can we avoid the hazard? Well, you could technically just reroute the railway. Given the topography of the area, you're either going to need to make a new rock slope somewhere, or an even bigger viaduct. So obviously that wasn't really going to be that practical. So can we remove the hazard? Well, again, technically you could, but the boundary fence was right to the crest of this slope, so that would have involved third-party land purchase. And it's also kind of quite a aesthetically important area for obvious reasons, so that wouldn't have been very favourable if Network Rail wanted to remove half the hillside to batter that back to 30 odd degrees. So then we're left with kind of our engineered solutions, so contain and strengthen. And like I was saying, one of the main differences between them is perhaps how much space you have, and we're quite constrained down on the toe of the slope with the railway there. So even though the hazards would have been fine to have been contained, the receptor that the rolling stock or trains on the track, they wouldn't be able to pass. If blocks of that size were coming down and being contained, that wouldn't really be feasible. So we're going to have to strengthen these hazards, prevent them from failing in the first place, hold them up there on the slope. Yes, we could put in, hundreds probably of reinforcement dowels. That would have dealt with most of the hazards, but it would have looked pretty ugly. It would have been probably a lot more expensive to build and a lot more timely, a lot more drilling involved. So instead of having to put that slope with reinforcement dowels, again, we looked at using the active rockfall netting to do all the work, and then we would position the sort of intermediate fixing anchors such that that netting is always in contact with the ground, and the netting is what's doing all the work there. Another benefit of active rockfall netting is it's not always that visible from a distance. It's a relatively sort of thin mesh. The diameter of the wire is quite thin, and when it's pressed up against the rock slope, I mean, it may be subjective, but I think for the most part, it's a lot easier on the eye than some of the draped mesh, especially when the stuff's wrapped in plastic. So again, that was another reason why it was quite a good solution for a site that's got a large number of tourists taking pictures, things like that. So aesthetics can also be a driver for choosing your remedial work. So I'll hand back to Corin, who will talk about how we use different types of containment somewhere much warmer and sunnier than Kent.
Not many veggies either. So.
Hooray.
So I had the amazing privilege to get to go to St Helena, and I've actually been out 4 times in total. There are 3 phases of work done out there, and so there's a bit of a mix of different types of containment, so I'll chat about that today. So where is St Helena? Well, it's that little red circle right in the middle of the screen there. It's a UK overseas territory, but what does everyone know about it? They know about a Frenchman, because that's where poor old Napoleon ended his days. I was very disappointed when I went to see the Napoleon film, because it was obvious that they'd filmed the end on a really nice island somewhere. Not that St Helena isn't nice, but they definitely hadn't gone, because you can specifically tell, because St Helena has a very specific look, as you can see on the left-hand side there. So 3 phases of work between 2007 and then up to 2020. And the areas are known as Jamestown Wharf and James Valley, which is the main town on the left-hand side there. And then Rupert's Valley is basically the next little valley over. So just a few photos of what these areas look like. So area 1 was the wharf. Now, when this work was done, that was the only way onto the island. The airport hadn't been built yet. So everyone and everything had to appear on the little ship there, and it had to go along this little road with these little buildings underneath that rather nasty looking rock face there. The second area was, so on the left-hand image there, that's the main town, Jamestown. The wharf is just off to the left-hand side there. You can see how the town is very kind of long and narrow, and it's sitting in under all of these rock slopes here. So you can see we actually had an awful lot of rock to deal with for such a small place. And the third area is Rupert's Valley, which is the next one over. So Rupert's had a new wharf built at one point, very similar to the James Wharf, but hopefully you can see, looking at the right-hand image there, you've got lots and lots of rock, but the valley was much less developed. So that was done a little bit later on. So what's the problem here with rock falls? Well, it's a extinct volcano, so the whole island is made of layered lava flows with some tuffs and some paleosols in between the basalt layers, and every time a new lava flow went across, it would bake them. So you had real preferential weathering of these weaker layers, and that led to potentially quite big failures of these thick basalt lava flows. But there's also ravelling of smaller blocks. So there's just literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rockfall hazards across all of the slopes here. And why was it a problem? Well, as we've said, you need a consequence as well as a hazard for there to be a risk. And what we had here was impact on people, property, infrastructure. And that's just a few pickies there of some damage that occurred down at the wharf. So it was a very real issue. So why did we do the works in 3 phases? Well, it was very expensive for a start, so we had to do it in stages. But it was actually the wharf that was targeted first. And a lot of people ask why. Why would you do that before you did the hospital or the school or houses or whatever? And it came down to 2 things. Number 1 is the geometry of the cliffs. It's an awful lot steeper above the wharf there, so anything that falls off is going to hit something. But also, as I mentioned earlier on, it's very strategically important because it was the only way onto the island at the time. So everyone and everything had to come on there. And there was like fishermen there, so there was local food production, absolutely everything. So it was a very important area. So targeting that area first, a couple of my colleagues got to go out to the island and do a site visit to try and understand these hazards. So recording the size and shape of the potential rockfall hazards, but also doing some site trials to release the blocks and see what happened to them, film them as we did it. So basically, they got to go out to a nice sunny place and throw rocks into the sea, which is a geologist's dream. What did we do after that? Well, we went back to our hierarchy, our flow chart of thinking about how we control and reduce hazards. And in this case, it was containment that was the best solution. And it was mainly netting with a few catch fences. A little bit of strengthening required here and there, but containment was the order of the day. Now, why did we go for that? So again, we're kind of writing out the other techniques. We couldn't avoid the hazard here. The wharf was the wharf, and it couldn't be closed for more than 2 to 3 days. There's no other harbour there on the island. It's not even a very good harbour itself. So there was no way to avoid those hazards. Removing them, We did actually do a bit of scaling and removal, but the rockfall hazards were so widespread and so rapidly developing that it wasn't suitable for use on its own. And same with strengthening, just too many hazards, too widespread for these sort of individual techniques where you're targeting specific hazards. So here's just a few photos. We had two types of netting, just a few localised fences on this job. And why did we go for netting? Well, it's quite simple to construct and repair rather than big sort of specialist catch fences. Uses more material, but in this case, because the slopes were so steep, it actually gave us the best risk reduction here. And most importantly, the repairs to the netting could be done by the local people. It was so difficult and expensive to get there at the time that one of the main things was to upskill the local people so that they didn't have to call for help if something happened. Designing the netting, fairly easy, but if you are going to design a rockfall catch fence, you do need to do a little bit more work. And one of the ways to do that is some rockfall modelling. So we simulate the block trajectories to get an idea of how fast they're going and how much energy they have so that we can then specify the rockfall barriers. Can be quite funny looking at a little red line on the screen, but we were lucky here we had done those site trials so we could look at how the model was showing us the blocks would behave and give us that confidence because we knew how they were behaving in real life. So what did the works entail in the end? Two types of netting, as I said. The bottom is your sort of, let's say, normal or standard passive hexagonal plastic coated netting that you tend to see. That's our Macaferi product. Other ones are available. We're not sponsored by Macaferi. And up in the top, the hazards were so much bigger that netting itself couldn't do the job. It would just have been wrecked in event of a large failure. So we overlaid that with some really strong, really meaty netting, which is produced by Dealbrook, which is Spider, which is huge stuff. So that's the blue and the red, and you can see the little yellow lines there show where some of our catch fences were. Who built it? They're called Group Cannes now, but it was Cannes France at the time for the St Helena government. And Cannes France utilised a helicopter on the island very usefully, sort of put together a lot of the netting on the wharf and then lifted it up onto the slope to where the guys were waiting. But all in all, it still took 7 months to do the work, so quite an extensive period of work. And that's what it looked like when it was finished. It's not quite so aesthetically nice as Henry's netting up at Glenfinnan. It's really hard, there's hardly any vegetation on the island, so you can't really hide a grey net on top of a brown rock. But actually the locals liked it because they said it made them feel safe, and they called it the hairnet. So it might not have looked pretty, but it did its job. I'm not got too much to chat about. I know we're kind of running a bit shy on time here, so I'll run very quickly through the next little section. But basically just to say, once we had done the wharf works, we then had to think about the rest of Jamestown and Rupert's Valleys. So we did a risk ranking exercise based on where the biggest hazards were, where the different receptors were, and concluded that Jamestown had quite a lot of high risk areas in it, that Rupert's Valley was generally lower risk. So our second phase of work targeted Jamestown, and our third phase of work targeted some little remaining bits of Jamestown and then across into Rupert's. A good indication of why you need this to happen. This rockfall actually occurred in 2008 when I was on the island, and buildings damaged. That car was really, really damaged, but nobody was actually hurt, which was I'm not a God person, but that was a miracle. So it was a really kind of sobering reminder of why we were there. It wasn't just a concept and something that you see in a book. So here's our kind of later phases. So the last one was Jamestown. This one is Rupert's Valley. Why did we need to come back to Rupert's when it was so poorly developed? Well, when they were building the airport, they actually had to put in a new haul road, and a lot of new infrastructure was put in. So there was a wharf, big fuel tanks, a fuel farm, power station, etc. So Rupert's Valley had to be re-ranked, and it then became apparent that we needed remedial works there as well. So the hazards are very similar to our phase 1 hazards, but the likelihood, consequences, very important still. But we have completely different geometry here. The slopes are lower angled. There's a lot of scree, which is going to slope blocks down. And so again, we decided that a containment solution was best, but what type? And actually, a little bit of a spoiler with the rockfall modelling there, but we actually went for mostly fences. So Rupert's Wharf is like James Wharf. It did have netting, the same two types as we discussed before, but it's just not economical to net all of the entire valley. I think even the locals would have got a bit tired of the hairnet if the whole valley was covered in it. So the slope geometry and the rockfall trajectories that we modelled suited fences better. And again, the local islanders were employed in the construction of those, and they were trained in how to repair them, and materials were left behind for use there for them to do it. So there was a good 7.5 kilometres of fences, quite high capacity, various locations around valleys, and a little bit of containment netting at the wharf there too. And just a few photos during the construction, some anchor drilling up on the slope, and then the chaps putting up the fence posts, pulling out the net. These come with the net sort of supplied around the fence posts, and you just pull it out like a shower curtain. It's great stuff. So those two phases, 10 months and 7 months respectively. Again, really great use of the helicopter. And a good indication of the success of these works. So the fences look like that. When we were out for the phase 3 design, we inspected the phase 2 fences, and we actually found that most of the rockfall impacts were where we thought they would be. They were at the right level that we had predicted, and the fences actually stopped about 100 rockfalls, with only a couple of locations where they needed a bit of a repair. So a good indication of success there. We do occasionally get these fences, the chances to put them up in the UK. Again, as Henry said, you need a lot of space for containment, specifically these, because they deflect by a huge amount. So just a couple of areas there. Left-hand side is an old quarry out in Dunoon. That's not our design, we didn't do that one, but we inspected it. And then on the right-hand side down in Dover there, Samphire Hole. So just to show you that you don't have to go to St Helena to see one of these nice fences. So that kind of concludes our presentation. I hope you found it interesting, just to get a feel for the kind of thought process of people like Henry and myself, and what we are thinking when we're actually specifying some remedial works. And hopefully some nice pictures of St Helena in there as well, which you can't go wrong with. So we'd just like to invite any questions, if anyone has them.
That was a great talk, both of us, very informative. So I'll kick off the questions. In terms of the UK rail network, how often are you called out to a slope instability or rockfall event?
More often than we've got time for.
Really?
Yeah, we're lucky to be involved in several frameworks through QTS, but also AMCO Giffen. And AMCO in Scotland have the what they call the civils asset management, or it used to be termed the minor works. So if something happens and there's reactive inspections required, we'll have to kind of drop and go to them. But we're also one of the framework designers for the planned works. So I would say what 80% of our team's work at the moment is actually on the railway. So that's why the St Helena and the Bardon Hill examples are actually from a good few years ago, because most of our stuff is on the railway at the moment, but we don't want to put too many pictures of railways.
So they're inspecting when the trains are off schedule or whether they're not running. Then obviously they instruct you to remediate the slope.
That's it. So they've got a process of rapid rock slope examinations, and basically all the assets across the country. They do the soil slopes as well, and they've all got they'll get categorised into one of 5 categories, and if they're one of the higher categories, then they go forward for design and remedial works. So a lot of the time we have good sight of the work that's coming. But other times it might be, oh God, it's raining, are they going to phone us this week? So we've got a nice mix of planned and
I must expect themselves to keep causing problems.
Yeah, there's some of them that the one that we put up with the fences at Samphire Hole down in Dover, the rock slope inspection regime that they have is quite tight. Even though an awful lot of money was put in to put these fences through, the slopes are about 120 metres high. So even though there's remedial works there, they still inspect those slopes very regularly. The whole idea with the remedial works is you don't have to inspect them quite as often, but some of them are just repeat offenders, basically, so they have to keep going back.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
So obviously in quarries our go-to is rock traps, and if you have a rock fall, you clean out your rock traps. I'm just sure, do you clean out behind the fences and clean out underneath the nettings?
Yeah, you have to, don't you? So in order to kind of keep them effective. So a lot of the time, and you can jump in if you like as well, Henry, but the maintenance burden for a particular technique is often one of the main reasons for selecting them. And I think the active netting basically needs very little maintenance, although it's pricey up front. Your whole life costs of not having to do a lot of maintenance on it. A lot of the time you control the selection of that.
Yeah, so with the straight rock wall netting, you design your sort of top anchors, and even the capacity of the netting itself up to a certain load. So when material starts to accumulate,
Exactly like this, actually. Yeah.
here's a prime example. So this was straight rock wall netting up near Pruitt, and attached at the top, attached at the bottom, and then one afternoon, whatever, quite a large rockfall occurred, and all debris sort of contained down the bottom. Now, that has so that type of rock netting doesn't have, it's quite possible, doesn't have much sort of elastic stretch to it, and it can get to a point where it will just burst open if there's too much material in there. So normally, you know, they'll go, oh, there's one there, oh, one happens over there, one over there, and you know, over the period of months, years, decades, it will start to build up. So you can very easily program in, oh, I think next month we should open up that bottom cable, get an excavator, scoop it all out, reattach it, no damage done, happy days. Obviously, a sudden influx of debris like this has caused the netting to get overstressed. I mean, quite amazingly, it didn't burst and go all over the road.
Yeah, there's only a little slit in it, but it's actually held all that debris, isn't it?
Yeah, but what was interesting is, so those panels are 2 meters wide. It had stretched the netting so much that panels now, or then, were 1.2 meters wide. So yeah, the sort of elongation, was far more. I think it is quoted on the data sheet how much they could elongate by safely, and it was far exceeded that.
Yes, that netting works well with draped netting if it can deform and deflect. So if you have that constant build-up, and either with an event like that or a slow accumulation, the netting can end up under tension, and then basically it can easily be punched at that point. So fences as well, you have to basically keep, they're usually designed for their capacity for energy, but also the height. So if there's too much behind it, you start to lose your height. So yeah, all of the containment solutions do have a measure of maintenance to them.
How easy is it to move the fencing if you're obviously developing the quarry? You have to move them once you develop the quarry, or do you want to use this in a sterile area where you up to your boundary?
Depending on what kind of barrier you use, the flexible ones are sort of alpine Swiss type affairs, and they're very pricey. So you would only really put them in if you're, if they're going to be there for a good long time. I mean, we've kind of shown containment there with fences. You can create a rock trap with obviously many different things, including movable things like barriers. And I think you've done some recently, Henry, places like Edinburgh Castle, where it's sort of obviously much smaller slopes and stuff than you're dealing with in a quarry, but it's kind of wooden planters with a fence on the top and stuff. So you could potentially use a fence as containment, but it would, if you're going to be moving it around, you might want to look at something like Jersey barriers or something with a fence on the top. So, but yeah, I don't think I touched on that in the end, but those kind of alpine St Helena Samphire hole barriers, they're not cheap. It's like Swiss things, Swiss watches, Swiss fences.
Come back to Bardon Hill Quarry. What was playing on nipping out the face? Was that not identified at the design stage of the quarry, or did it go a bit off piste and kind of got out of the phase? Design stage?
Design, yeah. I'm not actually sure because, well, it's quite interesting having been in the extension for Bardon Hill in sort of, I think it was about 2017, and there the rock structure in there was really quite different. So I think it's just, although these joints are big and persistent, I think it's really quite a changeable rock mass throughout over the scale of the quarry. Because the other area that we were looking at for a while, there was a fault that kind of went through one of the areas, and it was about 60 degrees. And it was smooth, it was all slick inside, it was like touching a window, and that wasn't a million miles away from the rest of Bardon Hill. So I should have said we were kind of involved in that project, but and I realised actually when we got to the end, it's like, I'm in front of the institution quarrying and I never mentioned the quarry regs, so I failed tonight. But the quarry and the geotechnical hazards that were being managed there, that was actually, they had an incumbent consultant looking after that. So unfortunately we weren't particularly involved with it till we got there and saw the mess and had to decide what to do with it. So but yeah, I mean the ultimate client for that was Aggregate Industries, but yeah, we were actually in design and build with Bam Ritchie's, so it was definitely a team effort there. Sorry, is that a question at the back?
You used a term earlier on in one of your slides there, dentition. When you should get a flip chart behind you. What's dentition for the uneducated?
So what I normally describe dentition as is basically it can be brick or masonry or whatever, but instead of it being a sort of solid structure like a buttress that you're going to construct up under something, a lot of the time dentition will be employed on maybe a rock mass that's got strong layers and weaker layers in it, and you've maybe undermined something. Oh, Henry's going to the board. So you can use dentition to basically protect the weaker layers from weathering away. So you're going to see that as little patches on the slope rather than a big structure. I feel sorry for all the people online that can't see Henry's artwork.
I was conscious of that, but I wasn't sure how you're going to explain this. I've seen quite a few.
Yeah, so I wouldn't classify it as a let's say sort of active kind of strengthening technique. It's actually more like protection, kind of like spray concrete. You're actually, it has a kind of dual purpose. It's sitting Henry's drawing, it's basically a wall sort of underneath an overhang there. But as I said, I've seen it employed quite thin, sometimes just a single skin of bricks to basically act as erosion protection for weaker stuff in behind it. So I don't know if you'll see it in quarries, particularly ones if you're sitting in the coal measures, for example, but then you're probably in a quarry, you're not going to be doing some nice looking dentition. It's actually quite labour intensive work, so a lot of the time we will try and avoid it.
Yeah, another thing to think about with dentition is, so if you form a sort of plug of concrete in here, is that going to become a hazard? And obviously the concrete will bond with the rock, but you still got an interface there, and over time if water could start to seep in there or whatever, is there any way that could then in future become a hazard? So quite often if you are going to be sort of building up a sort of shutter on the front, you actually, before you start everything, drill some rebar into the ground, so that when you're pouring your concrete not only bonds to the rock, but also encapsulates the rebar, which is grouted into the rock behind.
I don't know if any of you have been at Dysart Harbour at all. We were out there last year looking at a slope, and there's a lot of dentition there, and quite thin brickwork, as I've mentioned. But at one point when they were putting the brickwork in, they got some nearby apprentice brickies to practice all their techniques. So it's actually really quite nice looking, but there are areas of older brickwork, and that's itself becoming a hazard. So yeah, you've got to be quite careful in employing dentition, because it can, I've seen it on the railways where it's actually the dentition that's now the hazard rather than the rock itself.
Simple as this, you might actually ask yourself, well, could you just use active rock formatting that's going to be contoured in, and then it's easy to inspect, it's fully supported, yeah, and far quicker and easier to do.
We're not employed by Geogroup or Macroferry.
What's your thoughts of dressing faces by with excavators? Because sometimes you find when you start dressing up, you cause more hazards and it's breaking back, and you maybe lose a bench.
Pretty much, yeah, I was gonna say that's kind of, any time where we were working in any of the quarries, there were occasions, and I think perhaps at Bardon, where if we had gone too hard scraping away, we were gonna lose the bench, and given how tight we were round there, there were a couple of areas where I believe we put the active netting on just to try and preserve the benches in places. A lot of the time we're you're working in places like the railway and stuff like that, and Network Rail, because they don't want to disrupt the train services, a lot of the time you're out at weekends and nights and things like that, and the last thing they want to do is pay you to show up again. So a lot of the time, even if you scale a slope, I mean, I've seen a slope scaled and then something falls off it 3 weeks later, and it's just sod's law sometimes. A lot of the time we're being asked to guarantee, although I'll always be careful of the word guarantee, you know, the safety of a slope for a certain design life. So a lot of the time we'll employ scaling and removal and stuff almost as a kind of a safety precaution as much as anything else before we go on to the face to actually do works. There are some places where we work where we basically do manage the risk with scaling, but yeah, like you say, you've got to be careful that you don't just chase the rock away forever. Yeah.
One of the issues in Bardon Hill was the marl,
Yeah.
which effectively turned to mud when it got wet.
Curry sauce is what I remember.
Yeah, so you'd finish off a face one night and go in the next morning, and it was just sort of running along the bench.
Yeah.
It was horrible stuff.
If you had like a block of it, you know, like the size of your head, if you left it on the ground 2 days later, you'd kick it and it would break into the little chips. And yeah, I remember the curry sauce well because I ended up in it one day to the thigh, and I think my wellies are still there. So I'm trying to ever got them back. Yeah.
Once you anchor into them, if it was such a weak material.
Interestingly, the marl, the sort of netting and pattern dowels we did was actually, although you were dealing with a rock, the way that it behaved, it was damn near a soil nail design, wasn't it? So the anchors were actually, I believe, about 7 or 8 meters long. A lot of the time, the active netting on places like Glenfinnan, they're probably 3 meter dowels maybe. So we did have to go significantly longer, and instead of thinking about individual blocks coming away, we were modelling it almost as a soil failure. So yeah, we had to modify that, and also I can't remember what the pattern spacing was on the dowels, but it was a little bit closer than you'll use on a stronger rock, definitely. Yeah, it's horrible stuff.
I'm thrilled to see the image on the screen, because for perspective, I put that net up.
Was that yours?
And just to measure the 2013 that got put up as a result of the asset owner suffering 2 road closures a year from rockfall.
Yeah, because it's quite significant because you're going up to the Cruachan Dam, aren't you? Is that
So
it?
it's very-
Yeah.
So that entire face was scaled to remove everything that was loose,
Wow.
but we were limited to a small 3-foot crowbar, none of your 6-foot crowbars in there, because the difficulty was you didn't want to lose the slope, because there's a much higher slope beyond on this. So to put it in perspective, so I'm guessing we've had about 10 years life, and during that 10 years of life, the road's not been closed by rockfall, and that has arrested the flow.
It's done an amazing job.
And that didn't even close the road either.
Yeah. And what I can see over to the right is a patch repair. So prior to this big fall, there's obviously been a much smaller fall, pierced the net, and then they put a patch on, and then this big fall's happened, and that's restrained. So you invest in the rockfall netting,
Yeah.
you get 10 years of safe transit up and down. So I think
Definitely,
that's fantastic.
So our involvement there was we were working nearby with AMCO, who are doing a lot of the work there just now, and we were working nearby with QTS. So AMCO basically said, right, you guys come and get a look at this. So if I'm right in saying, Henry, there was only one anchor damaged. The rest of the anchors were totally fine, and so basically there was one anchor required, and basically just the netting just patched. So it's a repair. It wasn't a replacement, you know. So well done, excellent work. I like the way you recognised it. Yeah, it's quite.
It's like it's the overhead cables.
Okay.
So really, it was problematic putting it up because we were so close to the
Goodness,
high voltage cables.
Yeah, we did a boot for 3 minutes time, so I'll call it quits. So thanks for a fantastic talk. It was really interesting, really informative. Give Oxford appreciation in your manner.